Hi everyone, this is Professor Saunders trying out a new feature called Lecture Capture. And this week's discussion is on diversity. I am not going to record audio to every slide, but there are a few slides that I figured why not try out this new technology and record my voice in sharing my thoughts on diversity. So within this presentation, what I do want you to come away with thinking on for you is what is diversity, why diversity matters, looking at some outcome research, and maybe looking at how the connection between the textbook of managing teams and you thinking about diversity this week can help you create what your own vision, what your own strategy, and what are some tools that you would use in order to manage a diverse workforce. So in defining diversity, basically we're looking at a variation based on any attribute that people use to determine that another person is different. And so you'll see some types and you'll see some examples, which I know you're familiar with. But being able to properly categorize them when it comes to defining diversity is important. So when we're looking at visible differences, we're looking at race, ethnicity, gender, and age, where non-visible could be personal beliefs, someone's goals, someone's personality, someone's attitudes. Non-visible can also be functional differences such as work experience and education. Now, in some cases, I know we've all probably have been in situations where someone is making an assumption of somebody's work experience and educational levels. But to be honest, that's still non-visible and it's not something that we would know for certain unless someone had shared that with us. And I'm going to take a quick step back because, some research has said, okay, the visible when it comes to ethnicity. I would even push back on that because there's just so much dialogue on what ethnicity is and can you really identify that just by looking at someone. And so I want you to kind of think through really how do you define diversity? And are you making your assumptions or are you defining this based on what you see of someone or what you're assuming? Why does diversity matter? It matters for a whole host of reasons, but we all know we are living in a diverse world. We all know society's becoming way more complex now than ever before, whether that's complex in ideologies, complex in gender. I know now I am part of a diversity group and they want us to identify our pronouns. And that is something that's different. Now you'll see on email signatures, if someone identifies themselves as a female, you'll see her, she, hers, or male, the same thing. And so it's becoming much more complex. And so this is why it matters. It's because if we don't think about it, assess it, and figure out how we're going to comprehend and work with others that are of diverse backgrounds, then it may not lead to connectivity. It may not lead to a positive work environment. And so we definitely want to think about why diversity matters to us as individuals, to us as leaders, to the teams that we oversee, and to our peers. Weighing diversity, I'm sure many of you may have some ideas on how do you weigh diversity, what are some advantages and what are some disadvantages. I think that is something I would even suggest that some of you who lead teams on your jobs, maybe pose some of these questions to your group. What are some advantages of us expanding our talent pool? Is it an advantage of having multiple viewpoints? And then, is it a disadvantage of having diversity? Will we have less cohesion? If we do, what will we do about it? Could the potential to have more conflict come about? If we do, what would we do about it? So I would suggest many of you, as you are leading teams, whether that's in academia, whether that's on a sports team, in your family, on the workplace, that you begin to think about not just defining diversity, not just discussing why it's important, but how do you weigh diversity, meaning advantages and disadvantages. So this is just a changing racial ethnic demo that really forecasted what we're seeing today quite a few years ago. And I don't think this is anything unusual. I think this is something that we are noticing more and more. But it is important that we pay attention to the trends and the numbers that are changing. And here's another one, another graph from Pew Research that really looks at the changing face of America and whether it's white, black, Hispanic, Asian, and what our projected numbers are going to look like. Cultural differences. Basically, we're looking at how people relate to each other. The attitudes, the views, all of these things matter. So, for example, attitudes about time. That is different in some cultures. What time they start work. In some cultures, they actually give them 2-hour lunch breaks. They take a nap during the day. And then also cultural differences when it comes to views about the work environment. I know that next year, I've been asked to do a talk on what we're calling the gig economy. So really not just millennials, but we're looking at Gen Z, the generation that's coming up behind the millennials, and then looking at how they view the environment and how they view the workforce. And right now, it's big to be in this quote unquote gig economy where we're looking at, okay, you work here, you work here, you work here. We have multiple jobs that are creating a sustainable life. So it is definitely something to think about on how we relate to each other from a cultural perspective when it comes to our environment. Another graph looking at demographically diverse teams, looking at, the lower team functioning initially, but over time it could, lead to more groupthink, okay, if the team isn't diverse. So you really want to think about, this semester you've done a lot of reading about teams and what they look like, how to operate, what questions to ask, how many people should be on a team. It is important to think about that from a diverse perspective. The worst kind of group for an organization that wants to be innovative and creative is one in which everyone is alike and gets along too well. I thought that was an interesting quote because you don't want animosity or too much conflict, but you want a little bit because you want someone to kind of question, why do you feel a certain way? Is that going to influence someone a certain way? That has benefits and advantages as well. Outcomes of diversity, cognitive outcomes in task performance, effective outcomes in relational connection. I think you all can take a look at this slide and really think through, some of the stuff that may or may not be true. Minority members are less committed, have lower levels of satisfaction and less group identification if there is no relational connection. That's interesting. Is it true? Is it not true? Do some groups have a greater difficulty developing cohesion if there isn't another person similar or relational in the group? All these things, there is no right or wrong. I think that's my point, is that there is no right and there is necessarily no wrong. I think I just want everyone to start thinking about what are some potential outcomes? What are some even biases, and making assumptions that certain members will operate a certain way. More formal and frequent communication with those outside of the work group gives exposure to more ideas. You can even think about diversity from a internal corporate culture perspective, not even just race. A lot of times when we think of diversity, we think of race, we think of gender, we think of age, but there's also kind of how teams are structured. So for example, if you have a team that's focused on accounting and the financial books, and then you have another team that's focused on communication, you're wondering, well, they're two separate teams. But research has showed that sometimes being able to run some ideas by each other matters, because you could say from a communication standpoint, this is the messaging that we're putting out. But from a numerical standpoint, okay, you put this ad out, but it didn't garner the response that you wanted. We're looking at the traction numbers of which demographic within different communities actually watched that ad. And this is what the numbers show. So sometimes it's simple as having the communications team make a presentation on an ad that they're going to put out, and then going over the results and seeing, did our sales increase? If they didn't, why? So that really bridges the gap and brings some synergy between different groups within the same organization. So once again, as you're thinking about outcomes of diversity, positive, negative, don't just think of it from a race, a gender, or an age perspective, but diversity of thought, diversity of actions, how your committees work and operate. Managing diversity. There's a list of just ideas that you can kind of look through from understanding why you're diversifying. A lot of times, organizations are coming to the table like, we have to diversify, we have to diversify. They haven't even stopped to define what diversifying means and why are we doing it. Maybe we're actually diversified. Maybe it's possible. So once again, thinking ideas, not just gender, not just race, but including that, but really coming to the table and making a decision on, okay, these are the advantages. This is the understanding of why we're doing this. And then when you're managing teams, you really want to solicit their ideas and their best practices, not just speak to them on this is what we're going to do, but really get some feedback from them. Some additional slides that you're welcome to go through when it comes to managing diversity process, creating bridges, which I talked about previously in subgroups. This is a really cool slide. Diversity Inc., if you are not aware, they usually put out a top 50 companies for diversity every year. And every year the list has changed. And what I noticed with this year's list is that the criteria for selection has changed over the past, I want to say, 5 years that I've been following this list. And so now it's based off the talent pipeline, talent development, leadership accountability, and supplier diversity. And that is huge. And from I was working with some students who were leading a student group on campus, and even working with them to increase diversity. For example, it was a Greek lettered organization that was predominantly made up of white students. Now, there are historically sororities and fraternities that started on historically Black colleges, and I'm a member of one. However, I think through the recruiting process of these organizations, or, if they want to increase diversity, then where are you recruiting? Are you recruiting at the same location? And when you think about small businesses, we want to really, impact diversity. Diversity, yes, it's about talent. Yes, it's about leadership, but it's also about where you decide I'm going to buy my coffee every morning. Or, we have an office luncheon on Friday. And every month we order from Panera Bread. How about we find a small mom and pop business that is a block away from our office or across town that would like to supply us food for our meeting. So there are a lot of ways you can think about infusing diversity in the workplace when it comes to your team, when it comes to your ideas, when it comes to talent, but also when it comes to supplier diversity. And so you can see the top 10 list of publicly committed companies that are really aligned with diversity initiatives. Leveraging diversity, you can look through that slide, seeing differences, understanding differences. I think being curious and asking questions is so important. Not just making assumptions, but asking genuine questions of something you don't know or you just don't understand. Valuing differences, practice considerate leadership, what that looks like. And that's our last slide. So being considerate, leaders enhance functioning for diverse teams. Just take a look at what that means for you as you're leading teams. What does it mean to be considerate? Considerate leaders focus on the unique qualities and contributions of its members. They see their members as individuals rather than members of a subgroup. And I find that to be a really good measure of deciding, am I being an effective leader? Am I taking diversity into consideration? So that's this week's lecture, and I hope you were able to listen to it from wherever you are. Have a great rest of your day.